this is Hromadske Sunday show from our headquarters in Kyiv, the only primetime program in English, explaining now not only Ukrainian current affairs, but looking closely into the whole Eastern European geopolitical storm. And I'm Natalia Gumeniuk.
And I'm Ian Bateson. This week we want to take a closer look at Russian propaganda and the Ukrainian response. Now, since the murder of Russian opposition politician Boris Nemtsov, Russian propaganda has been in the focus again. The reason for that is people say that even if Putin and those around him, if they didn't order the murder of Nemtsov, that they created a virulent atmosphere based on very aggressive propaganda that stigmatized people who were opposed to the government and opposed to the official line. So we want to take a closer look at that. We want to look at what propaganda is, what the effects have been in Ukraine and Russia, and also how you combat it, what the antidote can be considered to be.
So first up, we have a panel with Yevhen Fedchenko, who is a co-founder of a Stop Fake initiative, which is exposing misinformation on the Ukrainian-Russian war. And he's also the dean of the Kyiv Mohyla School of Journalism. And we would like also to look on what's going on beside the media. So we invited Svetlana Masharovska, who is a political technologist and knows more how this information warfare goes offline.
First, though, we're going to be joined by Peter Pomerantsev via Skype in London. Peter is a former Russian television insider and the author of the book Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, the Surreal of the New Russia.
And Peter is in London, and there he, within this year, has given many talks and explaining that it's not just about propaganda. And the first question would be that. Hi, Peter, if we have you? Is Peter already on Skype? Yes. Yeah, great. So good to hear from you. And can you please explain? You usually say that propaganda is an old-fashioned world, that it's all about information warfare. Why? Why it's different?
Hello?
Yep.
Hello? I can't really hear you, sorry.
So you say usually that it's not about the propaganda itself. This is an old-fashioned term, and we have to use the term information warfare. Why? What makes, how it differs?
Oh no, I would never use the term information war. I think that's a very bad term to use. Because information war immediately kind of makes you think there are two sides doing the same thing. There's a doctrine, I'd be very careful with that term. Propaganda is just too broad, I find. I mean, propaganda means mass persuasion, which is everything from, getting people to use condoms to stop the spread of AIDS, through to, if that includes what, ISIS are doing, then it's an irrelevant term. Propaganda is just a form of persuasion. So I think we do have to be more precise. There's a Russian doctrine of information psychological war, which is a military doctrine which has been developed since 2008 mainly, where the idea is to contactless war, to bring another country to its knees without ever touching it. So by using very aggressive media, economic, blackmail, subversion, infiltration. So it's a contactless war. So that's what they mean when they talk about information psychological war. But generally we talk about weaponized information, so things that look like TV channels but have no journalistic intent. Their only intent is to use media to divide and conquer, sow division, spread conspiracy theories. So we're seeing an increasing amount of weaponized information, not just by Russia, across the world.
But I mean, if I were to ask a question based on the title of your book and what you've looked at, I mean, what is the potential of propaganda and media to shape reality? Because at the end of the day, it's not just television reports and stories, which are true or not, but it seems to have a real effect on people.
Yeah, I mean, it's very powerful. I mean, I think one has to also understand why Russia especially finds it very powerful. There's an old communist tradition which saw the power of propaganda to remake man. So it's a very Marxist-Leninist idea that propaganda could create a new society and a new individual and recreate the world. And so in many ways, propagandists as high priests of society, that's remained in Russia. Except now it's obviously not connected to Marxist-Leninist ideology. Sorry, I have some children in the apartment. It's a very old idea, but it's sort of, and then under Putin it's become very, very concentrated because around TV. I mean, for the Soviets it was about pioneer camps and the cinema and the circus and theatre and lots of other tools. But under Putin it becomes focused on TV, partly because he was created by TV. He's a TV president. He's not actually a classic populist. People say he is, but he's not really. He never had to walk through the favelas like Chavez, rising the masses. Everything, his whole image was crafted by TV and on TV. And the first thing he did when he came to power was to seize control of TV. So it's very concentrated in television.
And what is this ideology of cynicism you write in your book? What makes it special?
Well, listen, I think that's what maybe the most interesting thing about the Russian regime is, the current Kremlin regime, and how its propaganda is very different to Germany in the 1930s or America, let's say, in the lead up to either of the Iraq wars. That was sort of classical agitational propaganda, where the idea was to sort of make the public sort of believe in an ideology and believe in something in order to get them to do something. The Kremlin's propaganda usually isn't about that. It's usually about sowing confusion and making out that that everything everywhere is corrupt. So it openly admits that its own democracy is fake. You have Duma deputies sort of openly saying that, you know, the Duma is a farce and just theatre.
Well, and that's something you bring up in your book as well. I mean, you write about, you know, people saying that everything is PR, right? Everything is appearances and changing it. But I mean, what is special in Russia? Because it seems there's this culture of relativism, right? That you can kind of change and everything's relative. And I mean, I don't know if that's older than the Soviet Union, but it still seems to be there, and there seems to be no issue with saying one thing today and another thing tomorrow.
Yeah. I mean, this is something I think culturally, I think definitely it's a sort of a product of the late Soviet Union. I mean, of a culture where nobody believed in communism and yet kept on acting as if they did, and would have sort of one role they played at work and another completely contradictory one at home. And that sort of double thing has became part of culture. So what we see now is sort of a radicalization of that. Where you know, people, no one believes in the democracy at home, nobody believes in the capitalism, nobody believes in anything, but they can also be spun quite easily to be convinced that the Maidan is a fake, or that all Western democracy is fake, or that so it becomes, you know, cynicism becomes the main armory of the Kremlin, which is very great for people, you know, to keep the society sitting on their couch and vaguely paranoid about secret plots, because if you don't believe the world around you, you start believing conspiracies.
How
to motivate people to do anything. Thus, very few people in Russia actually vote. Thus, when Putin needs to get people out of the street to support him, he can't do that because the propaganda isn't based around agitation.
But I mean, when we say these things, or you try and talk to people, especially who aren't familiar with Russia or this part of the world, and you explain, you know, that people in power use television for their own interests or their stories which aren't true. Many people will say, you know, that's true anywhere. You know, people who have access to media will do that. Or, you know, there's a lot of concern this week in the U.S. where there, you know, is at least one poll that showed Fox News was voted the most reliable news network in the U.S. And as someone who's worked in television for a while, what is the difference between Western television and Russian television?
Well, hold on. Fox News is a cable network that its viewership is very small compared to CBS and ABC and the big guys. So imagine America only had Fox News. That's the situation in Russia. Imagine that's all their wall-to-wall Fox News, but not like the sort of like Bill O'Reilly. That's kind of a bit tame, but like, you know, that nutcase that they threw off in the end. What was his name again? The guy at Fox News that he was too much for Fox News even.
Oh, Glenn Beck, yeah. Yeah,
so imagine, I mean, Russian TV is the only Fox News and Glenn Beck all the time. I'm talking about the journalistic side. There's very good, actually, entertainment shows on Russian TV as well. So I mean, imagine all there was Fox News. Imagine there was no CBS, NBC, ABC, New York Times. Then you kind of have a vision of what Russia is like.
And how should the West handle this idea, and also the journalists who want to be objective? What is the way?
Well, just carry on doing your job. I mean, I really don't. I wouldn't get too carried away with, you know, it's an existential crisis for Ukraine. It depends where you are. Western journalists, I think, have been doing a very good job covering Ukraine, frankly. I mean, I think they...
But I think one of the points that Natalia is touching on, when it comes to Russian propaganda, in particular RT, there's this feeling, many Western journalists are confused about whether or not they have to present that position, whether or not they're being biased if they don't present it, but then there's concern that when it's presented, that it's, trying to present something that's not a real position, that's been fabricated just to get it out, create some black to white in an argument.
Yeah, listen, this is a big problem globally. The Chinese have got the same approach in what they call their three warfares. So they will sort of drip stuff into the media sphere to kind of make disinformation seem as if it's the truth. So, I mean, there's been several propositions around this. We have sort of, there's an idea to create disinformation editors. So editors of newspapers who would not publish the news that is not fit to print. Because what the Russians are trying to go for is kind of reverse censorship. They can't censor the Western press. What they can do is trash the information space with conspiracy theories and rumors and just, various forms of bullshit. So one idea is to have disinformation editors who would sort of just start sorting some of the stuff out. Maybe that's an approach. There's a problem with, there's a little bit of a problem with some of the reflexes that journalism has got into, which is sort of presenting both sides of the story, and the truth is somewhere in the middle. But what if one side is just lying? I mean, obviously, then the truth isn't in the middle anymore. So I think journalism does have to return to sort of investigative roots and fact-checking roots, which is something as an economic model that it's moved away from. Because the easiest thing as journalists to pick up the phone and get to opinions. It takes time and money to be fact-checking and investigation. So there's a real crisis inside journalism. And if journalism can't go back to doing what journalism is meant to do, then maybe we need to build institutions that will. So I'm thinking of
Okay, and Peter.
Oh, sorry, yes?
Yeah, so what we ask also then, what the effect of Russian media on the Ukrainian media? Are they copying it when you follow that? How does it feel? Or going in a different direction? How will you describe it?
To be honest, I haven't been following. I mean, I only know some developments in Ukrainian media, so I'm not in a very good position to give a good, objective, and balanced appraisal of it. I can see what Alessandra is trying to do at Vacher, but I don't know how many people really watch that. There was a reason that Natalia, you left mainstream Ukrainian TV. You didn't feel that it was somewhere you could do good journalism. I have noted, I assume the Ukrainians have been sort of coordinating their own sort of...
but maybe to ask it a different way, what do you think the antidote to propaganda is? What's the most effective way to fight it or to try and deal with it?
I'd be very... again, this word propaganda, we're talking about a huge array of things. The obvious one is strong journalism. And we have a worldwide crisis with journalism. So do we need to create new institutions? Do we need to create, a bit like with human rights, we need to create Amnesty Internationals? Do we need to create Amnesty Internationals of disinformation? Because increasingly journalism isn't doing this. They're not doing that kind of work. And that's a real problem. We thought we could live without a world without journalism, but now we're finding out what a world without journalism will look like. And this is not just a Russian problem. This is really a global problem. The information age has turned out to be the disinformation age. This whole myth that the internet would bring truth is turned out to be the absolute opposite. It's for a tidal wave of lying. And suddenly, while journalism, which should be dealing with this, is shrinking. So we might need to build large new institutions and almost new professions. The Stop Fakes, the Mythbusters organization.
That's what we will do now. Okay, so Peter, thanks so much for being us. We're going to the founders of the Stop Fake and not just to follow. And thanks so much for being with us.
Bye-bye.
So, the first question we have, obviously, we would be curious to hear your responses in general to what he was saying, but what is the role of media manipulation in creating and perpetuating a conflict?
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting, and I think the Russians realize the increasing role of media, and what Peter just mentioned, that they do not only see that as a propaganda effort, but largely as an information and psychological warfare. And this became the kind of integral part of any bigger war plans you can imagine. So the role of media is extreme here, especially if we talk about television, and if we deal with social media, I would tell these are the two biggest sources for propaganda for people, and that's why what we do at Stop Fake, we mostly deal with these two types of sources of this disinformation, try to debunk. One is television and another one is social media, and both of them produce a huge number of fake news, which we try to monitor, which we try to chronicle, and to make sure that we keep it in one place, because if people would only be consuming it and we would not chronicle it, there would be kind of illusion of a news flow, even if people would understand that, yeah, probably it's not that much true, probably it's kind of or exaggeration, but if we would keep it in one place, and anyone now can go to Stop Fake and found more than 300 stories were already debunked, and that's really huge.
Well, I think a big part of it is trying to approach it analytically. I mean, I think when you look at a lot of the propaganda or the manipulation, it becomes very emotional very quickly. It tries to play on fears and concerns and outrage in particular. And I mean, Stop Fake, I think what makes the project so interesting is it's trying to look at what's being said, to chronicle it, to see how it's changing, right, and what can actually, you know, if you can actually find a basis for it.
Yeah, so when we deconstruct this fake news, what we are doing, we basically de-emotionalize it. So we take emotions away and try to look at it from very classical fact-checking point of view and try to say, is it true? How do we know that? Who told us that? And then if we find very simple answers to that, it appears that it's not information at all, it's not news item at all. But the problem with this particular type of propaganda is that not about delivering the one particular fake narrative to the audience, but to create many fake narratives which would be around, and to make sure that people would be confused with this increasing number of fake narratives.
And this is this ideology of cynicism that Natalia mentioned.
Yevhen, and what will you, give us a feeling what are that? I'm just open the Stop Fake, and when you go down, you have just always a number of the stories, and they would be, you know, like from the Ukrainian party designed Hitler banknote, which is fake, or the Snowden accuses US of Nemtsova murder and things like that. What is the feeling these days? What are the fakes? Because for many people it just, you know, there is a lot of wrong information online.
Yeah, so there are different types of fake stories. There are very simple stories where you can, if you have a critical mind and you look at it, you can easily say, well, that's not true. And then again, you do one phone call or just look into figures and you realize this is totally fake. But there are a lot of really emotionally charged stories when you really need to look much deeper to understand what it's all about. And there are big stories which basically built into the bigger narrative of kind of fascism in Ukraine. Ukraine is a failed state and many other things. So these stories usually are supportive for this, again, bigger narrative, and it takes time to debunk them. But some stories are really fake from the very beginning, but we should ask the question, for example, why is the story about crucified boy appeared? It's not make sure that people would believe in this story. Of course, this story was kind of...
Ian we will present it now.
Yeah, we want to show this. I mean, this was something that was covered. It was shown on the first channel. Initially, it's a woman, you know, in tears who's claiming to be a refugee from Donbass, saying that the Ukrainians had crucified, you know, a small boy. And again, I mean, this is the point. For me, it comes back to playing with emotion and really trying to get people to react that way. But we want to show this video to give people a sense of how it works, and then we'll get your feedback.
Центр город – это площадь Ленина, у нас горисполком, и с одной стороны это единственная площадь, куда можно согнать всех людей. На площади собрали женщин, вообще-то потому что мужиков больше нету, женщин, девушек, стариков, вот этих, и все. И это называется показательная казнь. Взяли ребенка 3 лет, мальчика маленького, в трусиках, футболке, как Иисуса, на доску объявления прибыли. Один прибивав, 2 держали. И вот это все на маминых глазах. Маму держали, и мама смотрела. Вот это все, как ребенок истекает кровью, крики, визги. И что так взяли, вот туда надрезы сделали. Чтобы ребенок мучился, там невозможно было. Люди сознание теряли. А потом маму после того, как 1,5 часа ребенок мучился, умер. Вот это все происходило. А потом взяли маму, привязали до танка без сознания и по площади 3 круга провели. А круг площади километр.
Понятно, что когда-то это закончится.
Дайте нам свободу. Русских нету, русские не воюют. Это обычные работяги, шахтеры, труженики восстали, потому что...
So, I mean, this is a very emotional...
I'm getting very emotional.
Yeah, I mean, it's intense. But, I mean, who is this woman? Because you had looked into it and had, written about it.
So this is one of the examples of very unjournalistic stories, because it's based just on one source, and she was not even there. So she was taken as a source for the story, but she never proved to be there. And the story itself, how it happened, never proved to be there. But if we would look at the form, how it was created, it was really done in a way to make it very emotional. If it would get to the people who are very emotional, the first reaction would be just to stand up and go to Novorossiya and volunteer to be a part of those who struggle against these Ukrainian armed forces. And another very important story inside the story is that this is basically a very biblical story which deals with a historical way of telling the story. So it would really ring the bell with many people, like, oh, this is kind of a modern Jesus Christ from Slovyansk, and
somehow seeming believable enough and being mixed.
Absolutely. So it's not making it more believable. It's making it more unbelievable. But the more unbelievable, the more people are likely to believe in this. And this is kind of a paradoxical scene when that's actually what Peter describes, that nothing is true, but everything is possible. And this is example of the story where nothing is true inside, but this makes the story especially possible.
They've heard it. I mean, what I find so important, I want to say interesting, but it's not quite that. It's a very dehumanizing video. I mean, the point is it moves people to want to be active, it moves people to want to be violent, but based on an event that never happened. And people who looked into this, I mean, I think Stop Fake wrote about it too. They believe this woman was an actress who's appeared in many different videos on Russian state media and playing different roles. And so, I mean, that's the thing. People start to believe that it's real. They're motivated by it, and they're angry with people that they had close relations to before. But in fact, in that case, it never happened.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd like to ask Svetlana, who is a political technologist, and we are very grateful for her to speak on us in English. And so you said about, and as a political technologist, about a particular campaign, which is that it's not just about the that it's all about also some political campaigning, like during the election times, which are offline, gossip campaigns, whispering campaigns in different towns. What is that? Can you say what's behind, what is else but media?
Okay. Information war against Ukraine was conducted not only by force and media. In a very powerful tool in our region are gossips. They are spanned by special trained communication specialists. At first, these people are recruited and training. After that, they announce necessary messages. It takes place in communication in everyday life, in the markets, transport, on the street, among friends. For example, they can tell you a fictional story about nephew who was killed Nazi in Kyiv, for example.
Okay.
Many
and it's very interesting, what having spoken to you before and what you're mentioning now, because this is something many people in the West don't understand. They understand propaganda to media, television, internet, but the fact that you would kind of co-opt the spoken word, things people have heard, passing on that way, which I find interesting, because in the Soviet Union that was a very important source of information. The state media was controlled, but you kind of believed people who are coming back from somewhere. So having people go and speaking outside of a bus or outside of a market or in a train station is a way to get a message across that way as well.
So what are the other examples of these talks and chats and campaigns and what they are about?
For example, before annexation of Crimea, people was scared by stories about trains with aggressive nationalists who were traveling to Crimea and who killed Crimea people. And this technologies work.
Who were these people who are spreading the rumors, and where are they coming from?
Just people.
No, I mean, like, if they are not doing that unwilling, who are these people? Are they
Ukrainian, Russian, special.
But are they actors? I mean, how does someone get that kind of a job? Because it seems maybe
is
not
it
the
a
most
job?
typical.
Yes, it's job. It's special job, special training, and special money.
Provided for it. Because, I mean, this is the interesting thing, too. You're a political technologist, and many people in the West aren't quite familiar with the term, that it's not just political scientists, it's someone who can run a campaign, who knows how politics works in the system. And, if we look at that part of the dark side of that is manipulating people, through that sort of thing, putting a campaign together to get words out there on the street, media, but also spoken, word of mouth.
Yes, of course.
How much they are paid? Is it a high-paid job for these people?
This people is simple people who talk these messages about Kremlin propaganda.
Yeah. So how much money they get? Is it like a...
I don't know. It's small money. I don't know. But I mean, 40
hryvnia.
15 green, yes.
Okay, so about $2.
Yes.
And what is we would like to also, what is the evidence? What is the connection from where you know that? How we can confirm that it really happens? What is your source?
I don't know this.
I mean, so this campaign, as you said, it's going on. How we can check that it's happening? What is the evidence for that?
In the even region, in city, even goals and messages for the people.
So I just understand, have somebody seen these people? How often it happens? What are the proofs?
Proofs. Many proofs.
Like, for instance?
Well, but have you met people who've done this job, who've gone out and whispered, and they've admitted to you that they've done this?
Of course.
I see. Okay.
And the last question also would be for Yevhen. So you're doing Stop Fake. It's all about fact-checking all the media. How about the Ukrainian fakes?
Yeah, that's a question we're always asked again, because for the need of this balance, which Peter already at the very beginning. Yeah, we do balance, we do have a balance, and we do look at Ukrainian fakes, but they are not as numerous as Russians one, they are not systematic, they often look more like really bad fact-checking.
It seems more like lazy journalism, often more than a message.
That brings us back to the basics of journalism, if journalists and editors are doing their work, or if they are doing it in a kind of more Ukrainian way, and it brings, again, distortion of news, and it brings again, more reasons for those who are saying that, oh, well, that's Ukrainian propaganda versus Russian propaganda, you'd use that as well, and that's kind of very good to blame both sides. And again, it plays for propaganda well, because that's make people believing that there is no truth at all, which really is one of the biggest aims of Russian propaganda, to make sure people would never believe that the truth is possible, democracy is possible, and anything else is possible. So
well, that's a great note to end on. So thank you so much for joining us and for those points. Now, though, we want to move in a different direction. We had, as we announced on Twitter, we had a special guest that we met with last night. So we're going to go to that video now. All right, so joining us now is Shteyngart, who is an author who wrote Absurdistan, as well as the memoir Little Failure. He also wrote Out of My Mouth Comes Unimpeachable Manly Truth for the New York Times Magazine, for which he spent a week in New York's Four Seasons luxurious hotel, watching nothing but Russian state propaganda TV. So Gary, thank you so much for joining us. Our first question would be, why would you put yourself through this? How did that all begin?
The New York Times made me do it.
They made you do it.
It was not my idea. I mean, I'm okay with suffering a little bit, but this was more than I bargained for.
What was the effect of it? I mean, the title of the article is what you learned from it. So, I mean, what are the lessons you're still carrying with you now, after some time since the article came out? Well,
I think the major thing I realized is that Russia is a country that doesn't seem to know what it is in the year 2015. Is it a European country, a Western country? Is it a Eurasian country, whatever that means? Is it its own planet, sort of? So many of the shows I watched were basically American, movies like Avatar and whatever. But at the same time, the propagandistic aspect of it is these news programs where you feel that Russia is surrounded by Ukrainian fascists on one side and European gays on the other side, and everybody wants to destroy the Russian way of life.
And I mean, how does that work? Because you have, the image you were talking about, consuming all this media was, Russia's under attack, the West is trying to corrupt everything, homosexuality, all these things are trying to tear Russia apart. But I mean, from when you were talking about the movies that were shown, they all seem to be Western movies. There seemed to be so much Western culture, and then this huge kind of tide of anti-Western sentiment, too.
I think if Russia was a normal country with a normal economy and a normal government, reaching out, becoming Western would be very natural. But there's a feeling, I think, that Russia can only be a superpower. And if it lacks that kind of superpower status, if it's only a regional power, people are upset, and they're willing to trade some of the, the economic benefits of having a real economy that just doesn't exist off of gas and isn't a kind of kleptocracy. They're unwilling to trade that in if it means Russia's just another country. There has to be a bigger idea than that. And that's what the news seems to be saying, is that Russia is a special country no matter what.
Gary, there is a lot of bad TV worldwide. Why we should treat it seriously? What is special with that?
I think the interesting thing for me is that there was no relenting, So in America, you have a television channel called Fox News, for example. But Fox News hates the Obama administration. It likes Republican administration. So every viewer, there's different channels. One is pro, one is anti, and you can hear different points of view. What was shocking about Russian television for me was that every single channel had the same point of view, and the point of view was basically directly from the Kremlin. And we know that officials from all these television stations regularly meet with Kremlin officials. So that was the relentlessness of the message, the fact that it kept being said over and over again, was a little surprising for me. There's some channels like Dozhd, the independent channel, but it is being slowly squeezed out, and very few people watch it, and it's not available on a lot of cable stations.
And besides, you also visited and talked to a psychiatrist. What is it all about? What did he say? What did he say to you? And what was special also with the techniques used by the television in Russia?
Well, you watch enough of it, and I think very few people actually watch it, 12 hours a day. So not even people in Russia, who I hope have some jobs, watch it that long. But after a while, you watch, 70 hours of it, and you become a little crazy. I started drinking a lot. There was a good mini bar in the hotel, very expensive mini bar, but a good, well-stocked one. I started taking sleeping pills because I couldn't go to sleep. I was just going, the Putin show was in my mind so often that I needed some kind of help. And it was nice to have someone to relate it to, because I was also not allowed to leave the hotel and to talk to normal people. So it was very nice to have the psychiatrist visit and talk about what this meant to me. Also, I grew up in the Soviet Union. I left when I was a child. So for me, there was a kind of strange echo, of Soviet television. But I have to say, I don't remember Soviet television that well, but I've seen some of it. But it was never, I don't think it was ever that angry against the West as current Russian television is.
But I think part of it, when you look at maybe Soviet television and especially Russian television today, is it's this idea of a threat from outside, that you need to be on your guard, that you need to be on edge, which might be a reason why you're having trouble sleeping. It seems, this whole emphasis with Putin, increasingly as things go badly, especially with the currency, it's that these are sacrifices that need to be made, that this is an important period in time, that, they need to be ready for whatever happens. And is that something, was that an impression you had, or what was your reaction?
Absolutely. No, that's one of the most interesting things was that a lot of the shows, some of the comic shows would make fun of, for example, middle-class Muscovites with their Louis Vuitton bags and, you know, and their love of stinky cheese and stuff like that, while at the same time portraying ordinary Russians. You know, up in the Arctic North, there was a documentary about a postman whose wife hunted ducks, and they all, you know, he didn't drink any vodka, and they just ate ducks all the time that they hunted with their own hands. So there was this very strange kind of, you know, we all have to tighten our belts now for the sake of the ideology and for the sake of the president. And that was something new, because for the last 15 years, with the exception of the fiscal crisis, because of oil and gas prices, there was a slightly better standard of living from year to year. And now the television seems to be preparing the citizenry for years of a contraction of GDP per capita. And so you have to live less like Muscovites and more like duck hunting people in the Arctic North.
Well, and tapping into, to this idea that Russians know how to suffer and that they can do all of that. But to turn back to a point you brought up earlier and expand on it, I mean, what was the image of Ukraine that they were presenting when you were watching Russian TV?
Well, you know, if you were just a casual viewer, if I had not seen the news for the last 10 years and I had turned on television, I would have thought that Ukraine was now controlled by a neo-Nazi regime, which was bent on destroying everyone, you know, from Russians to Jews to Tatars. Everyone would be killed by this neo-Nazi regime, with Hitler parades across the streets of Kyiv, and a government that is attacking the innocent people, the innocent Russian speakers of the Donbass region. That's exactly what's portrayed. There's no, you know, there's no other alternative to it. It's an absolutely spooky twist on the reality of the situation.
Well, and since you touched on the reality and you're confronting it, I mean, what's been the reaction you've gotten to the piece since it came out?
Well, the reaction was very predictable. You know, I mean, the intelligentsia in Russia, I think, understood it, but, you know, there's a whole I think there's people whose main job is just to hang around Twitter and get angry at pieces like this, and so they got angry and using language I probably can't repeat on television. But you know, it was a very funny reaction. A lot of it was very you know, pointing out that I'm Jewish, and so obviously I'm being paid for by either the Zionist government or the State Department of the United States, or the idea is that the New York Times is controlled by the State Department.
So I mean, basically, they're trying to, you know, presenting Ukraine as this right-wing fascist state, but then criticizing people for being Jewish as if that explains everything.
It's a very interesting leap of logic, I have to say. It's quite unbelievable, but it is also very believable, because the enemies are both external and, in the case of Jews in Russia, internal. The fifth, and of course, Boris Nemtsova, who was just killed, was half Jewish as well.
And Gary, here we definitely understand, because sometimes even our network, when we interviewed the Russian soldiers here, they said that they watch Russian television and they really had a different picture. And while they were going to fight, or even if it's the volunteers, they really believed in what was the Russian television saying. But what could be an antidote? What could be done? How to counter that? When we live in a democratic societies and when we believe that the different views could be expressed?
Well, I think the key is to be able to turn off the television, but it's very hard for huge parts of the population, especially older people, people outside the main cities. It's very hard for them to do that because in many cases in Russia and in the former Soviet Union, it's the only form of entertainment available. It's both entertainment and news. So it's not easy. But, you know, the people I know, and I'm from St. Petersburg, and they never watch the television. And my best friend there told me, you know, that it's like, you know, catching a virus, being forced to watch it is like a, you know, bacterial weapon against the masses. So what they do is they read the internet. There's a couple of websites that are pretty good. Slon, Open Russia. There's some Hromadske. There are some websites that are still impartial. And that have, you know, a sliver of the truth at least. But for my friends, watching television is a nightmare, and they couldn't believe that I would do it for 7 days. I can't believe I did it for 7 days.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's interesting to hear your experience, and we hope you won't be forced to watch any more terrible television for at least a little while.
No more. Thank you. Bye-bye.
And we are very grateful for you being extremely active this Sunday night on Twitter. So we really appreciate that. And just to bring up some of the tweets, Peter Reinbeck written that a well-informed public is very hard to manipulate with propaganda. The truth always prevails, as we now slowly see with Crimea. Or, for instance, the question would be from Herb Randall: how do you counter these fake stories with the many people who get their news from casual conversation, friendly and family? And as well, the other is, it's about the emotions. So very true, Ivis Inder writes that very true regards emotions, stops people thinking critically strong on social media where everything is fast to click. This is a new challenge for all of us, but I encourage you to go to our webpage en.hromadske.tv and follow our social networks with what we're trying to do. And going on with the conversation and the, let's say, Ukrainian response to the information war, we have the Deputy Minister for Information, Tetiana Popova, and also Oksana Romaniuk from the Institute of Mass Information and representative of the Reporters Beyond Borders here in Kyiv.
So, Tetiana, my first question would actually be for you, because when we look at, what's considered to be the problem, which is Russian propaganda, lies, things that were able to take a difficult situation and make tensions much worse in Ukraine. And, the Ministry of Information was seen as sort of part of a Ukrainian answer to that, an antidote to try and control media and shape it. But at the same time, when it was created, there was a lot of criticism. It was nicknamed the Ministry of Truth, compared with an Orwellian model, all of that. So, what is your response to that criticism, and what is the ministry doing at this point?
I think the best response to criticism will be to do our job well. I'm personally responsible for ATO zone, for restoring Ukrainian broadcasting there and bringing Ukrainian media there.
So making sure those areas are covered in Ukrainian media.
Because you know that they occupied our TV towers and they broadcast now their Russian channels, and our main goal is to put around ATO zone extra transmitters in order to broadcast Ukrainian channels there. So we started from Donetsk, we introduced several newspapers there, special editions for Donbas people, and that's my main responsibility for this job.
And Oksana, maybe if we could just ask you a question too. What would you consider the antidote to propaganda, or how can that be confronted?
Well, I think that we have seen during summer and during the autumn that the main target in the regions which were occupied were the local media, because people trusted local media. They did not trust really the picture from Kyiv, they did not trust really the picture from Moscow, because they were too different. But small local media were speaking their language, they knew those journalists, and those local media were just crushed. People came there with bats, with those Molotov cocktails. We recorded 39 attacks on local media offices. We know that many local journalists had just to escape. So one of the reasons to restore trust to media there is to help those local media operate again. I know that many different international institutions have focused on that, on providing aid to those small local outlets. And another question, another two positions I would say would be to restore, or not to restore, to start to initiate a quicker response, a quicker official reaction from press services, because it is impossible situation when after a bombing the official version from Ukrainian side comes within hours, while the Moscow side gives this version immediately.
They create this bombing, and so it's easy for them to put a press release immediately.
They do this immediately on the official level, and at the same time they put several versions in social networks.
Yeah.
So, and at the time when there appears the Ukrainian version, everything is already covered with a mess, with conspirology, with different, all that stuff.
But my question would be also to Tetiana, because we heard about the creating of the channel for an audience, Ukraine Tomorrow, about the Ukraine's army of trolls, the volunteer army who is going to counter the messages online. But isn't the bigger challenge to change the media environment and have the officials to be accessible and responsible to the question? Doesn't this, or for instance, while I was working on the front line on the Ukrainian side, you definitely do not have there were old ladies who said, like, we have Russian channels, we don't have any paper from Ukraine, so facilitating the local papers would be a stronger thing. Isn't all this creating television networks like Ukraine Tomorrow just a PR, or sometimes even get publicity like with Army of Trolls?
So as I told you, I'm responsible exactly for Radio Zone, first of all, and because I was before advisor to Ministry of Defense, so I concentrated on this area and on this tools. Ukraine Tomorrow is responsibility of Yuri States Minister. I believe he will be happy to join you one evening and explain.
Well, we tried to get him, so unfortunately that wasn't so easy.
His English is not so fluent, so maybe because of that. And about Internet army, so it's actually not trolls. It's just opportunity to provide our information through Internet, our position towards what's going on and what's happened. Yeah, like bombing in a trolleybus station in Donbas. We need to respond not only officially, because.
But who are you responding to? I mean, who do these people respond to if they're?
Now it's 35,000 people who signed to our communication.
Right.
It's, I think, more than 5,000 of them are from Russia. At least they are registered from Russia.
What are they doing? They're posting to Facebook, Vkontakte, Twitter? What is theirs?
They can post wherever they would like to post our materials. We use actually materials of existing famous volunteers groups like InfoResist or like InfoSprotiv or Inform Napalm. So it's just explanation what's going on, of showing photos or videos of Russian soldiers in Donbas. So it's.
But are these people marked? I mean, if they're sharing something, if they're presenting some sort of a message, are they doing it on a private social media account on Facebook, or is there some indication?
They can do it whenever they would like to do it. They can do it in some forums, so they can do it in.
But I mean, there's no indication there that they actually work, that they're part of this internet army, correct?
I think by spreading this information, they will somehow identify themselves as a person from this internet army, I believe, because we give one type of proposal to share the information.
Oksana, and the media lawyers and the media community in Ukraine has concerns about the different tactics of the Ukrainian government on counter the propaganda. What are they, and how they approach you and about their concerns?
Well,
and what is your also concerns?
Our concern is that propaganda will not work in the Ukrainian society because our society is just different from Russian. What is propaganda? It is the way to make the life easy. Yes, it is for people who are not ready to take responsibility, who are not looking for questions, who are just looking for black and white world. But we had Maidan, we had revolutions, we have 20% of volunteers in Ukraine. At least we have a long tradition of criticism in the Ukrainian journalism. Our journalists are criticizing the government all the time.
But I mean, compared to a lot of Western programs, Ukrainian journalists are a lot weaker. They're less critical. I've seen interviews of how Ukrainian journalists handle politicians. They're much more willing to let them speak and get their message across.
Really, it's not about Hromadske. In Hromadske, they're doing well.
No, they're different.
Noticed less of criticism. We have noticed two trends this year, actually, two absolutely opposite trends. One trend is towards observing more journalist standards, because it covers maybe some 20% of journalists who have seen how information can start the war, and they have understood their responsibility. We really have discussions in our office with journalists who returned from the ATO, from the combat area. They came to us and they sit like this and say, how should I report this without emotions? How should I report this so that this information be real journalism? This is the first time since I don't know how many years I'm working in journalism that I have seen that journalists themselves started to discuss journalist standards. This is the first trend. Another trend is absolutely contrary. This is a trend towards too much patriotism. It covers maybe the same part of journalists, maybe some also 15 to 20%. They would be more eager to self-censorship. They think that it is better not to criticize.
What's the same response to the propaganda? It's them feeling they need to say it the other way.
It's self-censorship. I wouldn't say that it is something vertical, like in Russia, because in Russia we have vertical structure.
They control all TV channels,
of course,
all
but in Ukraine it's just we have very pluralistic media market.
It's a different structure. I want to show one infographic, and then I know you have a question to ask. But we have one just comparing different budgets, because as you know, Russian, RT and others, they've had their budgets increased. Hopefully, we'll pull that up in just a second. And the Ministry of Information has a much smaller budget in comparison to that.
We have only budget for the office, so not for creating new channels. But it's good that we have two channels.
Well, I thought the budget also is supposed to cover Ukraine tomorrow, no?
I think it rather will be donation plus some maybe small extra budget from the government budget. But until now, we don't have it yet.
But Tetiana, you're definitely not a minister himself, but there is a lot said in Ukraine that the ministry had been created for a minister, because Yuri states he has very close links to Poroshenko. He used to work to the channel who belongs to president for many, many years. And how is that different from Russia when they have the media, this institution led by the ally and the close supporter of the president?
I think it's good that he has experience with first and the biggest informational channels, because it means he can create channels. And we actually need to create ATO channel. I hope we will do it.
The channel on the anti-terroristic operation?
Military channel. We also hope we will work with Radio Liberty and Hromadske of Donbass. We want to do something like a joint channel. So it's one. It's actually my responsibility. And second is this international channel.
And would these channels? Would they come from the budget for the Ministry of Information? I think we finally have that infographic.
No. The first channel I mentioned, it will be a donation plus Ministry of Defense.
Do you think it's all about the preaching the choir, like trying to make the people who are already patriotic more patriotic, rather than really targeting the people who live on the area?
Actually, ATO channel will be targeted on occupied zones, first of all.
But the problem is the trust. Do you think that people in the occupied zones would trust the channel which belongs to the Ukrainian Defense Ministry?
I believe that they will trust Donetsk journalists. And the main
they would trust, Hromadske, Donetsk, maybe, but they will not trust
but anyway, they
channel
need to
which
know,
belongs to the defense
they
ministry.
Anyway need to know information about where was shelling and so it will be rather like using our footage and using our short news, because anyway they need to know our news about which corridors is existing for refugees.
Of course,
well, that's a project we'll be watching closely. I think we'll have to move on, but you have a video you were going to introduce.
I want to do that. I hope I will be able.
I think, there is a lot of discussion, and there is a discussion about that in the society, in the media society. So we thanks a lot to Tetiana from the Ministry of Information and Oksana from the Reporters Beyond the Borders. But and thanks for being with us. And this week is also special. We would like to show you the video, which was filmed here at Maidan in Kyiv, but it was a commemoration march named Donbass is Ukraine, Donetsk is Ukraine, because exactly a year ago there was a first person killed at the pro-Ukrainian rally in Donetsk, which more or less marked the start of the conflict.
Числа патриоты вышли в Донецке в очередной раз.
All right, welcome back. So now we're going in a slightly different direction. We're looking at Ukraine's present and the direction it'll be moving in. We're joined by Jerome, Vacher, the IMF resident representative here in Ukraine. Thank you so much for being on the program.
Thank you for welcoming me on this show.
So, I mean, Ukraine had some good news this week, and they're very happy to get the $5 billion tranche that had come in. The first question I had is looking more towards the future. Now, this year, Ukraine expects to get about $10 billion from the IMF, but the IMF has outlined key criteria for what needs to happen in order for that to be there. What are some of those? I mean, what needs to happen for the next, installment of $5 billion to come through?
As you said, it's just the beginning of a process. So we'll have now a first tranche of 5 billion, which will be disbursed immediately after the program was approved by our board. But it's important to remember that in order for the board to approve this disbursement, there were already a set of measures which were agreed and discussed and which were part of the program of the authorities. So we had what we call 7 prior actions, which is basically a set of measures which were taken and agreed by the authorities, including on the budget, on issues related to the energy sector.
But if I understand correctly, some of the issues, what we've seen before this tranche had come through was focusing on the legal framework, setting up things, putting them there, but there hadn't quite been the implementation yet, where my understanding is for the next money to come through, it's really important that it's implemented. Now, it seems like parts of that would be an external audit of Neftohaz, the main Ukrainian, gas importer, which is, criticized greatly for corruption. So, I mean, are there hard timelines that Ukraine has to meet these things in order for the money to come through?
Absolutely. I mean, beyond these prior actions that we had, and that are in the program and the commitments of the authorities, there are a number of measures and policies that need to be implemented, and we call them structural benchmarks. It's a technical term. But that means that over time there will be a number of steps that need to be taken with a proper timeline. This is all public information. It's on our website. So it is part of what needs to be done, not only to change the legal framework, but also to work on the implementation, including on the energy sector.
And
we definitely will show to our public this information pie when we see that where the money, where they're coming. There are $5 billion, $2 billion from the US, $1.1 billion from the European Union, and $10 billion from the IMF. But we don't really understand, because when you look in the figures, for instance, the Greece within 2010-2014 get $240 billion US dollars. When you look, for instance, to the money which was given to Poland when it joined the European Union, it was like 90 billion. So is this a lot? 10 billion, 17 billion? Is it a lot for the country like Ukraine in this current stage?
It is actually quite a lot, and as you mentioned, it's part of an effort by the international community to help Ukraine. But actually, in percentage of GDP, of the gross domestic product of the economy, it's one of the largest IMF programs ever. So it is an important effort, and as was mentioned before, it is also quite front-loaded. That means that it's a program for 4 years, but our board agreed to disburse a significant amount, more than half of the amount of the program in the first year.
Now, a question, because you're an expert on this, so we're very happy to have you here. You can explain things, and especially financial topics. Everyone knows money is important, but understanding the details is more difficult. I have a two-part question for you. One, there are a lot of accusations that when Yanukovych had fled and people in his government had fled, they took money that had been loaned to Ukraine with them. Billions and billions of dollars we're talking about. What sort of a framework is in place now, to keep the money that's given Ukraine where it's supposed to be going? And then on top of that, where is this money going now directly? How much of it is going to Naftogaz, or how much is going to the military?
The way the IMF program work, we are here to help sustain the external position of the country. So that amount of money will be reflected in the level of reserves of the central bank. That is the most important part of the program. So that will bring more confidence. We also devote part of the amount which is disbursed to budget support. And that goes basically to one pot. Of course, the best safeguard for us is to make sure that the policies are properly implemented, that the fiscal policies that we discussed are properly implemented, and the same with the National Bank of Ukraine. So out of the 5 billion, we have 2.7 billion, which goes to budget support. This is something that we do on an exceptional basis, especially when the government is facing constraints to finance itself on the domestic market.
Is there any deadline for especially Naftogaz reform? What is in your framework?
Well, we have a number of measures on Naftogaz. I mean, there is the issue of, as you know, of gas and heating tariffs, which is an important component to address the financial situation of Naftogaz, but also to reduce corruption, to reduce energy consumption in Ukraine. But we also have measures aimed at bringing more transparency to Naftogaz. There is also a significant reform of the gas market as a whole, and that is also part of the programs that the government has put in place with us. And we have a number of steps. Also importantly, we believe that there is no reform of the energy sector without also instilling some payment discipline in the sector. So that means that there is also an important law which is now in Parliament, which is aimed at allowing Naftogaz to collect the debts which are due. And it's not debts from households, but it's debts from corporations which have not been paying for a long time. So it is also part of the equation.
I was trying to strengthen the system in that way. But I want to ask another question, because we're talking about this money, which at least for people, for me or for others, it's quite a large amount. It's more money than I'll ever see. But it's not free money. I mean, what are the terms for Ukraine having to pay it back?
Well, I mean, part of the new program, as you know, we had a program which was agreed in the spring of 2014, which was called a standby arrangement, and which was a very short-term nature and designed to help stabilize the economy very quickly. Now, with the impact of the conflict, which has had a significant impact on confidence in particular, we saw that the balance of payments problems of Ukraine would take longer to resolve. So the Ukrainian authorities asked for a different kind of instrument, which is called an extended fund facility, which is over 4 years instead of 2 like previously, and which has also a longer repayment period. So that will also help Ukraine. But this is a facility which is also designed to help a country which has a number of structural reforms to put in place.
Really in years, because there is always a speculation that, like our grandchildren will pay all these Ukrainian debts. So is it decades or just 4 years when the Ukraine should pay it back?
It will take several years because the repayment period, as I said, is longer, but that is also helping to smooth the repayments. So that it does also mean that instead of having a short-term repayment period like we had before, which puts a lot of burden on the country. We have a longer repayment now for several years.
But is this effectively allowing Ukraine to kind of restructure its debt? Is it able to take money from the IMF to kind of pay off other debts, and does it have better terms with the IMF than it does with other creditors?
Our terms are concessional by nature. But what is important to see is that we have now a financial package with a contribution from the international community and also a contribution from which is expected from the private sector. So that is also an important part of the component. We had identified about $40 billion in financing needs over the next 4 years. So the IMF will be 17.5 out of this. There will be about 7.2 billion at the moment, because this of course can change, and bilaterals can provide more money. And the rest is basically contribution from the
What are the
private
risks?
sector.
What are the risks involved in this country?
Well, we are very much aware that the situation is difficult, and of course we are very much aware of the conflict which is going on, and that is of course the main risk to our projections, and that makes the life of all of us very difficult. I mean, just forecasting the economy, we are aware that there are many risks. We try as much as possible to offer a candid view to the board and to the public. What are the risks? And of course, there are also other risks which you see in other programs. It might be a lack of commitment of the authorities at some point, some additional difficulties in the financial sector. But overall, of course, the main risk to our baseline is a conflict.
And the last for me, the IMF is seen as being non-democratic, and they kind of just dictating what the country needs to do. So does this really help Ukrainians? Because many of these reforms, they hurt Ukrainians who are worse off in terms of energy prices and pension reforms. And, we kind of understand that would be IMF would be a scapegoat for the Ukrainian government to make the reforms.
That is fair in a way, but we have discussed this reform program for a number of weeks, if not months, already with the government. So we have had an intense dialogue. We also have a dialogue with parliamentarians, and we try to have as much dialogue as possible, including with civil society, for example, on the issue of anti-corruption. And we try to design with the government a program, in particular on the fiscal side, which tries to alleviate some of the short-term economic pain. The social assistance will be increased by 30%. The social assistance going to pay for energy bills will be more than doubled. So that is also an important part of the global package.
Of how it will affect people. All right, well, thank you so much for being on the program and explaining that news to us. Now we want to turn to a different direction and look to Ukraine's east. There have been a lot of events in Moscow recently. One of the most major has been concerns about President Putin's health and where he'll be. There's even been a Ukrainian site which has paired a counter for how long it's been since he's had a public appearance with music from Swan Lake. Now, Swan Lake is well known in the former Soviet Union for being played in 1991 after a putsch was organized against Gorbachev. And I think we have some of the website to show what's counted down, how they're tracking all those days. Can we get that up now? Yeah, there we go. So we have the ballet dancers from Swan Lake. Not quite clear whether or not Putin would be the white swan or the black swan, if that applies at all. And then counting to see what has changed.
So for that, we are calling to Anna Nemtsova, a long-time Newsweek and the Daily Beast correspondent based in Moscow, covering Russia and Ukraine, and doing a magnificent job, also reporting the recent events. She's been for many years reporting from Chechnya, and there is a lot of buzz now about the Putin disappearance, but there are a lot of things happening behind the things with the Russian establishment. So that's what we want to hear. What is the mood unfold in Moscow, what's actually happening. And we are waiting if Anna is on Skype with us. So before I ask the question to her, I would, Anna knows what we will ask. Behind all these talks about Putin being away, when we follow the media, you know that there is a huge fight between the security service, federal service, in Russia, and also the clan of Kadyrov, the Chechen president, who is a strong ally of Putin, and it's all over the papers when one of the strongest institution is accusing the other, and everybody wants to understand what does it mean. So do we have Anna? Because she's definitely somewhere online, and was.
All right, we're going to be changing what we're taking a turn in a different direction. We'll be getting Anna on very soon because we do want to hear about Moscow, but we're actually very happy to have a different guest now. We're pulling in now quickly.
Yeah, because we would have another, it's all very friendly here because we have a friend of Anna as well, but who is just coming from Donetsk and Mariupol, a famous reporter, Simon Ostrovsky.
Simon Ostrovsky, very happy to have you here.
How are you guys?
Yeah, we're doing all right. It's a lively Sunday night. Some events, we get some interesting people in the studio, so that's very good. How are you doing? How have your most recent trips been?
It's been interesting. I've just spent about a week and a half in Mariupol and in Donetsk, and we produced a bunch of dispatches for Vice News, which you can check out on vicenews.com. We did 2 dispatches on Mariupol, the city which many people think might be the next target of potential attack, and we were in Donetsk at the airport where they're using prisoners of war to look for the bodies of fallen Ukrainian soldiers there, which for me was a very powerful story that we did because you know, it's incredible to be standing next to these people who are essentially slaves, and you're right there with them, and your situation is so far beyond what their situation is. It's hard to imagine another type of place where you could be standing next to a person who's, you know, at a lower social position than you, that much lower of a social position than you. It's pretty strong.
How is the general situation in Donetsk, which is under the separatist control? Because people speak about the ceasefire, we definitely understand there is no such escalation, but what's happening now?
It's pretty quiet in Donetsk, actually. I mean, there are obviously incidents along the front line, but you know, you hear artillery fire off in the distance, but it's nothing like it used to be when you could actually feel the blast waves just when you were in the center of the city. So I think, you know, the ceasefire, although it's not 100%, it's really holding up until now.
And I mean, how does the mood there compare with Mariupol? Because there's still been active fighting near there, right?
Well, I think in Mariupol it's really much the same as it is in Donetsk. There's a few shootouts every once in a while, but there's no sort of, it's not a war, it's more of tit for tat, harassing fire every now and again. I don't think anybody at the moment feels like there's going to be an imminent invasion of either Mariupol or the other way around in Donetsk.
Now, and what's the role of Azov Battalion there? Because you had been out with them and there are people in the field, and you pointed out that they're one of the few battalions, or, you know, including the Ukrainian army, that's actually taken new territory. I mean, what is their outlook? Are they being more active, or is it the same tit-for-tat situation?
Well, during the fighting for Debaltseve, when the Ukrainian troops were surrounded, actually Debaltseve and the areas around it were taken over by pro-Russia forces, which led to really a lot of Ukrainians, military personnel dying, and a lot of equipment being left behind. The Azov Battalion, which is this far-right battalion, some of whose members express sort of Nazi ideology and symbolism, like, you know, some of them have sort of SS things written on their helmets. And
or tattooed on the back of their heads.
Or tattooed on the back of their head. No, there was one guy in our dispatch who had some Norse runes tattooed on his head, which I think is something that far-right people enjoy doing for some reason. Anyhow, when Debaltseve was going on, their response to try to take pressure off of the fighting in the north was to launch a counterattack in the south, because they wanted to draw some of the pro-Russia forces away from Debaltseve down towards their area, and they actually managed to take, I don't know, 10, 20 kilometers of territory outside of Mariupol, and thereby move the front line 20 kilometers closer to the Russian border, away from the city. At least that's how they tell it. I wasn't there at the time, so I don't know whether it was just the Azov battalion which took this decision to take the pressure off of Debaltseve, or whether there were other parts of the Ukrainian military which were also involved, but they certainly like to take responsibility for it.
Yeah, but that's what you often hear from them. And what is your access? I'm very curious, how easy is it to get into the Ukrainian army position? And it's very interesting in this conflict that you can be both in both sides, in the DNR control area, with the Ukrainian military, with the battalions. How is it for you?
Well, with the Ukrainians, there's a few layers of bureaucracy that you have to get through before you want to film anything. If you want to go to film something as simple as a checkpoint, you can't just roll up and then turn your cameras on, because that'll get you in trouble with the soldiers there, and they have guns, and you don't want to get in trouble with people who have guns. So they end up phoning their commanders, and their commanders invariably say, no, don't let them film. And so then you have to go through other official channels, and often it takes a lot of time. And, you know, I'd say 70% of our work as journalists isn't actually going and filming something, but it's arranging to get permission to film something. So that's all of the boring behind the scenes that goes on, is like being on the phone endlessly with people, trying to get them to agree to let you go somewhere, go through a checkpoint, film something else, get the right work. You know, these days, if you want to be able to film on both sides of the front line, you need 2 pieces of paper from the Ukrainian government. That's the ATO press card from the Defense Ministry, as well as a pass. And the pass will only allow you to go through 1 checkpoint. So if you want to go through any of the other checkpoints, you need to get passes for those checkpoints as well.
That's interesting, because we kind of don't have these troubles. Maybe it's something but it maybe depends.
No, you get a Sector B pass that allows you to go through Kurakhova. But if you want to go through like the northern checkpoints, you need a pass for Sector C or M. I don't remember what all of the passes are called. That's just the Ukrainian side. If you want to film on the separatist side, then you need a so-called civilian press card issued by the separatist government there, and you also need a military press card issued by the sort of intelligence services of the self-declared republics. And that's not including Lugansk region. I'm just talking about the Donetsk areas controlled by the separatists. For Lugansk, it's a whole other set of paperwork that you need. So
good, it is still a paperwork. There is a question from you, from the people watching us. Romaisha asked, there is a focus on the areas where conflict continues. Are conditions improved in surrounding areas? What have you mentioned that?
No, conditions are getting worse, because there's a blockade, which I think has been going on since December, for food products and all kinds of products. And the Ukrainian checkpoints are being very strict with people who want to bring anything into the region. It's part of Ukraine's policy, which I think probably your viewers know about, to economically starve the separatist regions. And that's hitting the ordinary residents of the region very hard. It's not a measure that only affects those who have taken up arms, obviously, and I think it's geared towards creating social unrest and dissatisfaction with the separatist authorities. I don't know how effective it's been so far, but what it has been effective in doing is making it very difficult for people to get food.
So what's the mood on the ground now? I mean, compared to a few months ago or the last time you were there? There's a ceasefire, so in Donetsk it's quieter, but are the people more frustrated or struggling more?
I don't know if people are more frustrated. The situation has been really tough for a very long time, and I think pretty much anybody you speak to expresses their anger at the Ukrainian government, who's stuck behind the front lines because life is very difficult there, and they end up blaming the Ukraine for a lot of it, because it is the Ukrainians who aren't allowing the food to come through. And especially recently, there's been a problem at the checkpoints with just regular people wanting to get in and out. There's been reports of bribes being taken on the Ukrainian side.
That's what we're extensively covering for the last month or so. There is a huge debate here as well, with different organizations trying to sue the government and to sue the security service for all that. But that's a lot of paperwork.
We had
as well.
one other tweet, if you want to pull it up.
Yep.
We had it here. So we have from M-Pops, am I looking at it right?
Yep.
From behind me? So they're just asking you, so you were there from the beginning. Can you summarize Ukraine's year from your perspective and the way forward? I mean, do you see the conflict differently?
It's hard to summarize a year. But I think what Ukraine hasn't done is sort of taken away the fuel for the Russian nationalist fervor in eastern Ukraine. I think Ukraine obviously hasn't done a lot of the things that it's been accused of by Russian propaganda. There was never a genocide of the Russian-speaking population in Ukraine. That was exaggerated, but I think a lot of Ukrainians take that to mean that they didn't have any fault in what happened. And I think that they should take the humanist initiative, and instead of leaving issues like, the Russian language and decentralization as cards that Russian nationalists in eastern Ukraine can play against them, they should give those rights to people all across Ukraine, so that the nationalists wouldn't be able to throw that, in the face of Ukrainians. Why shouldn't the Russian language be an official language in a country where nearly half the population speaks it as their first tongue? Why shouldn't regions have more control over their own destiny? There shouldn't be a special status, in my view, for eastern Ukraine and the areas controlled by the separatists. I think every region should have a special status, and that would take the fuel away from the Russian nationalists in eastern Ukraine.
I mean, and 2 points on that. There are some Ukrainians who support, some more rights for the regions because they see it being as a corrupt, overly centralized system, and that if things were closer, there'd be more potential to try and fix it. But coming back to your other point, because we've been talking a lot about propaganda tonight, and you talk about giving fuel to Russian nationalists, to separatists, to others, anything that you have that seems to be cracking down on Russians or less tolerant or vaguely oriented towards right parties creates fuel for that. But if I'm going to play devil's advocate, which I will for a moment, it seems like even when that's not true, it gets made up. I mean, you can make these actions, but there's so much spin, and there's so many things that are made up. And, when I've spoken to people, and I've been in the East not for a while, what people kind of relay, the stories they have and what they believe is often not really based on the truth. It's stories they've heard from relatives or from people who have their own strong biases. So how do you balance that?
I mean, I agree with you, but I'm not sure what your question is.
You're making the argument, they should give more rights to regions, or they should give more status to the Russian language to take fuel away from these fires, this criticism for Ukraine. But that criticism will always be there. Does the reality matter when propaganda is so strong?
Well, I think that's a cop-out to say that it doesn't matter what we do because they're just going to lie about what we do anyways. You've still got to, provide justice and fairness for your citizens, no matter what outsiders say about what you're doing. I mean, you don't take actions in order to affect the way outsiders see you. You've got to take actions in order to try to improve the lives of the people who live in your country.
But I mean, in Ukraine, so much depends on the way people in other countries see it. Their financing, their support, Russia's actions. It seems like that's almost a luxury they don't have. They're constantly worried about people think. Now, they're not always the best at shaping that image, but that's a much more major concern in Ukraine than it is in many other countries.
Well, I don't think Ukraine has a huge problem with getting its point across to the countries that see themselves allied with Ukraine. And that's where Ukraine is getting its support from. And I don't think that's going to change, to be honest. Ukraine's problem is really with Russia. And it's up to Russia to change, I think, in order for their behavior towards Ukraine to change. I don't think Ukraine can change Russia's behavior in any way. But what Ukraine can do is change the situation on the ground for its own citizens, and I don't think you need to think about how Russia sees that. You just do need to take away the fuel for that extremists use inside Ukraine.
But I mean, I think that's a separate, there's the fuel question, but I think what you're touching on is Ukraine needs to try and build the best society it can for itself, for the people who live here, and for the future that it has, as difficult as that is. And I mean, I think that's a perfectly fair point to make there.
For me, there would be, the last for me, while you're working on the ground, especially on the separatist control areas, there was a lot of talk that these guys get out of the Russian control, that they are kind of the world lords. How is there? What is it? We understand it's very hard for the journalists to really film the Russian military because they definitely don't want to be filmed.
Yeah.
But in general, can you explain more how it's working, how they are coordinated?
How the locals...
How independent they are.
How independent the local politics is from Russia?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't have an inside view into how all of that works. I don't walk around with Fedchenko all day and listen to who he's talking to on the phone. So I can only try to, make inferences about what's going on. But there's definitely a core of people who are local in both Donetsk and Lugansk region who are against Ukrainian statehood. And there's very obviously Russian influence and Russian arms and Russian fighters in Ukraine that's been established time and time again. Journalists who I trust have seen with their own eyes columns of Russian armor going across the Russian-Ukrainian border into Ukraine. We saw those 10 airborne troops who were captured in Ukraine and paraded on Ukrainian TV. Today, I think, is the premiere of the film that Putin gave an interview in about Crimea, where apparently, I haven't seen it yet, but he admits that he ordered the annexation of Crimea before the referendum. So
that's all in the trailer already. You don't even have to watch the film to get that.
So, I mean, probably 6 months from now or a year from now, Russia's involvement will become, clear and admitted by the Russian side in eastern Ukraine as well.
And just very brief, while there is a lot of anxiety, so what would happen there? It's not up to you to decide and to see in the east, in the front line.
Yeah.
So does it look at it's getting calmer, or is it there are any sign that another big fight will start?
Right now, it doesn't feel like there's going to be another big push from either side. I think both sides are interested in leaving things on an even keel right now. I think the Ukrainians took some really punishing losses over the last couple of months. And the Russians achieved, or the pro-Russia forces achieved all of their tactical goals, if not their strategic goals. They evened out the front line. They got rid of that annoying pocket, which made it very difficult for them to travel from Donetsk to Lugansk and Debaltseve. They took over the airport and pushed away the line from their capital city. So, right now, I don't see what else they would want to achieve. Why waste so much energy when they could just solidify what they already have? They're trying to do what they're calling state building. At least that's what it looks like.
Okay, thanks a lot, Simon. We're really happy to have you here, and definitely all your fans would watch your dispatches. It's already more than 101 of the Russian roulette.
Yeah, 101. You can go on YouTube and just type in Russian roulette dispatch 101 and then watch them backwards. Or go to vicenews.com.
You can go back in time, traveling to the beginning.
en.hromadske.tv, and we will fight over that. But while we are very happy to have on our Skype Anna Nemtsova, who is a long-time correspondent for Newsweek based in Moscow, and also for the Daily Beast, and who reported for many places, the eastern Ukraine as well. But we want to know, to hear from her, what's happening in Moscow. Is Anna. Yeah, Anna, thanks so much for being with us with this really late hour. Great to see you. So we talked a bit about this buzz around appearance. But we know also that there is a big fight between the FSB, which is a security agency, and the people from Kadyrov clan. What's going on? What is the mood in Moscow? What are the important things?
Hello, Natasha. Nice to hear you guys. So this is a unique situation for Russia. As Stanislav Gluchovsky put it recently, for the first time in Putin's 15-year rule, King Kong of Russia's security agency, FSB, former KGB, is in conflict with Ramzan Kadyrov's Chechens. And for Putin, it's a very important dilemma right now to choose between justice, between these investigators from Federal Security Service and Kadyrov, who is his most loyal guy in North Caucasus, providing security, providing stability in North Caucasus. Maybe that explains why the president chose to keep it lower, lay lower and wait until the situation resolves by itself. But on the other hand, we hear a report today by Dosh TV saying that President Putin is sick with the flu, and actually he is staying somewhere in Valdai, his residence. There have been a lot of speculations about Putin's whereabouts, but the only thing we know for sure is that his spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, doesn't want to solve the mystery for us. He refused to give the concrete information about where Putin is.
Well, and Peskov was so interesting because, he was claiming, this is parodied a lot, he was asked about Putin's handshake, if he had a strong handshake, and he said it was so strong that it would break your hand, right? And I think it's interesting because so much in the Russian media, there's a when we talk about propaganda, or at least influencing it, when it comes to Putin's health, he's always shown as being athletic, as being strong and being fit. So this whole issue of him being older, after, all this time in power isn't really addressed. I'm curious, when watching all this, seeing this conflict kind of emerge between Kadyrov's people and the FSB, it reminds me of those power conflicts you had in the Soviet Union when power changed, when Stalin died, when Brezhnev died, when Khrushchev was taken out by a putsch. Are there parallels there? Do people really feel like people are positioning for a change in power?
Well, I am in Crimea right now.
Okay.
And reporting on the events, on the celebrations that they're preparing for tomorrow and Wednesday. And I've been asking people about the way they feel. They've been waiting for Putin to come here to Crimea for the celebrations. But there is no sign that he is any place close and if he is coming or not. So there is a sort of a strange feeling as if children were left without their father, orphans, a bunch of orphans. That reminds me of some episodes in my childhood when this or that leader was feeling sick, and it was a sort of a time without time, very strange periods of time when the country was waiting for some big news about the leader.
Anna, since you are in Crimea, that's what we know now. So what's happening there? What is the mood? What are the troubles of the people, and what are the good things? Just give us a bit of feeling.
Well, yesterday I was in Simferopol, and it was a sunny day. Hundreds of children marched across the center, along the central avenues, in red, blue, and white ribbons and gloves, colorful gloves, chanting slogans about this happy or successful future with Russia. Some kids looked happy, some looked really tired, and some were yawning and complained that they were sleeping. Otherwise, the peninsula is preparing for some celebrations that will take place tomorrow. Some in Simferopol, some in Sevastopol, I guess. There is nothing too artificial. People seem to be living their natural life over the spring is here. Some trees are already in bloom, apricot trees. And I've been interviewing a bunch of businessmen, some private businessmen who complained about the situation with the economy here. But state employees seem to be more or less happy about their salaries, pensioners about their pensions.
And Anna, coming back still, there is a question to ask you that your latest article at Newsweek is about, it's named after Nemtsova murder, the Russian opposition seeks a way forward. So what is a way forward? What's going on after all that in Russia?
Well, Natasha, I interviewed most key opposition leaders after Boris Yevhen was killed. And some of them sounded quite depressed, especially Vladimir Ryzhkov, who said that Nemtsov was the key figure for organizing all the protests, and he knew who to call, how to organize this or that street protest. He was also a key figure when it came to communication between opposition leaders. Some opposition leaders are in conflict with others, but he always found a way to communicate and the issues. And so without him, it's more difficult for them. As you know, Russian opposition is broken into little groups, and they really need to find a way to consolidate their ideas, their powers.
Okay, Anna, thanks so much, and we are looking forward to have you here in the studio in Kyiv. So looking forward. And besides that, we also put your attention to, for instance, the tweet of another Russian journalist, Leonid Rogozin, who has written that Putin's disappearance has neatly swept away Nemtsov's death from the world news agenda. And going on with our marathon, it's already looking like that. We also, Kyiv is a place to be tonight. It seems like we have here Victoria Ivleva, who is a rewarded Russian photographer and who, has won the World Press Photo in 1991 after covering Chernobyl disaster, and now really often in Donbass, often in Luhansk Oblast, helping the people being evacuated from the rebel-controlled area and covering a lot of Ukraine. So, Vika, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for inviting.
So maybe the first would be from me. There are very few journalists working in Luhansk Oblast. It's smaller than, it's tiny and further than Donetsk region. But what's happening there? What is the biggest issue and how it's to work there?
First of all, I do not work there as a journalist. I never have any journalist documents with me. I work there only as a volunteer, and this is important for me to underline this, because I think I'm the only Russian volunteer who is supporting Ukraine and working there. And what I do there, to me, is my way of supporting Ukraine.
Does that confuse people? How do they react when they understand you're a Russian helping people to...
No, they like me there.
No, I didn't mean they didn't like you. I just mean,
the people in Lugansk.
In Luhansk, yeah, that when they find out you're helping people to evacuate to Ukraine.
We're not discussing politics. We are doing more important things there.
Just focusing on the task of moving people.
Focusing on the task. Did you take all the documents? Where are you going to go? How are you going to stay? What money are you going to receive from Ukraine, or for how many months you didn't receive anything at all?
Okay.
Etc., etc. So we discuss vital things and not all this.
So what are the vital things? Because there are a lot of concern, especially the people who are handicapped or the people with troubles.
Life is the number one thing.
Well, in terms of getting food and medicine, or how to...
I do evacuation of those who want to leave the place. And I always tell them that I think whoever side you're on, this is not a place for women and children. Definitely not. Later on, when one of the sides, as I used to say diplomatically, is going to win, though I know who's going to win, later on you may return, but not now. Now definitely it's not. Especially there's lack of food, there's no money for many, many months. I still don't understand how do they survive. Even to me, it's an enigma. And I think there are some pawn shops that are open and where people could sell their little goodies, but not that much to sell.
Well, that's the story that we've heard. People trying to hold out have sold their valuables to try and get by. The people that you meet with, do they need convincing to leave, or have they already made the decision?
It's always tricky because some of them they're hesitant, and they're hesitant mostly because they don't understand what are they facing? There's no special invitation from Ukrainian government, like saying, please do people, you're our people, do come here. There is a flat or a room or whatever you're going to stay. Everything is organized by volunteers. There's no state, just volunteers.
One of the parallel structures we've heard about where volunteers and donate to create a structure that's not there.
There are volunteers in Lugansk, the local people, local volunteers and local businessmen who are helping those people. It's again like volunteering. And then there are other volunteers on the Ukrainian, on the territories controlled by Ukraine, who are organizing different camps for those people, places where they could survive, the food, medicine, etc., etc., etc. Sometimes there are some traces of Ukrainian state, but unfortunately not as much as I would like to see.
And just, I mean, maybe a question that interests me personally, you know, you're someone who's worked there for a long time and you come back to Kyiv as you are now. What is something that the people in Kyiv, you know, outside of these areas where there's active fighting, what's hardest for them to understand, or what maybe do they not realize about, for people here about life there and you know, what people are facing?
We've been just discussing it. Just half an hour ago, I was in a lovely company of my Ukrainian local friends, and we were discussing it. And it just happened that I've been to many wars in my life, and people of war never understand people of peace, because people of war, they suffered so much to such extent that they think that the whole world around them is guilty and the whole world should do something for them. But people of peace, they don't understand this because they're not guilty as they think for the war, though we all are guilty. If the war happens, we all are guilty. So there's an absolute misunderstanding, because people coming out of the war, they
expect it to be compensated?
They expect a reward for their suffering, and there's no reward because we're not guilty. Why should we reward you? What for? And why should we listen to your bloody complaints? We have our own problems. And I would never forget, last summer, in June, I lived in Slavyansk, and I was evacuating people from Slavyansk. And the first family I evacuated was a family with 7 children. And it was probably on the 26th or 27th of June, so much before the liberation of Slavyansk. And we came to Kharkov, and we went to the railway station to buy the tickets. This family wanted to go to Russia. Actually, it's up to them where they want to go. I never suggest. I ask them, where would you like to go? If they choose Ukraine, they go to Ukraine, we get them tickets, or we take them to Kharkov and then get the tickets. If they want to go to Russia, it's their choice. I'm not influencing any of them. This is none of my business in a way. So we came to this railway station, and it was an enormous amount of people trying to buy tickets. And I decided to go to like special place of high comfort and get the tickets there. So I took the little girl from the family, and it was clearly seen that it's a girl in shabby clothes, you know, and anyway.
So an IDP or a refugee in that case.
So we went to this place and I said, I just evacuated a family from Kharkov. Could we get tickets, please, without queuing, because they need to go to Russia? And the woman said, oh yes, it's 20 hryvnia on top of every ticket. Yes, please do. I said again, I just evacuated a family from Slavyansk. Is there any way to get, and I understand she doesn't understand, because I was expecting she would dash and she would say, oh, little girl, please do take, I don't know, a tart or a cake, or here's some water for you and invite your family.
Well, that's what you're saying about people of war and people of peace. You've been through something, you expect help, and someone at peace being like, why would you expect anything different? Why would you have something else?
Okay. Pay 20 hryvnias on top and you would get the tickets.
Have you stayed in touch with any of the people who've moved on? Because in Ukraine, for the refugees who move farther west, there are a lot of stories about discrimination in housing or even employment. I mean, what do you hear stories from people you've helped evacuate afterwards, after they've gone to Russia or other parts of Ukraine?
I do hear stories. I'm in touch with some of them, not with all of them. And I have to say, those whom I evacuated, they all are fine. They're all fine, though they all were scared and they've all been hearing of the rumors. I also hear of those rumors. I know that they exist, and not only rumors, but facts. But me personally, I never came across any of those facts. On the contrary, in Kharkov, there's a big center for IDP called Hromadske. And people were very hesitant about going there because it's a big place. It's like a former children's camp, like resort area. And one woman was like, oh no, I'm going to take my children back. I don't want to stay here. I don't want, and I thought, oh gosh, I'm going to take you back and you will stay in your, wherever you stayed, because she just was so irritating. But I understand that she's a special woman from a special position. So, Natasha, please do calm down. Everything will be fine. Okay. In a week, she rang me and she said, oh, I'm so happy I'm here. Oh, thank you so much. Oh, forgive me. This was the sweetest moment.
Well, it's validating.
Because the last for me that you have published a book which is named the Tour, a Travel around all along Ukraine. Throughout.
Or the Facebook war.
Yep.
This is true.
So you've covered many wars, and then you come here to report a lot on Ukraine besides doing your volunteer job. So what are your, after this year working on that, what are your main, learning from this place? Because you travel all around, from Donetsk to Lviv, coming to the very...
Ukraine?
Yeah.
I think it's still a very sweet and tender country. I still stay to my words that I said a year ago. It's a very tender and sweet country.
I can't think of a better note to end on, but thank you so much for coming and speaking to us. And thank all of you for, thank all of you for joining us. And we've had a long program, but we hope it's been interesting and educational. And join us next week for another edition of The Sunday Show. Good night.
Ми, журналісти та ведучі Громадського, ми вирушаємо на схід.
Любого врага мы не пропустим дальше.
Есть люди, которые нормально, которые в открытую нормально поддерживают проект.
Громадське телебачення презентує «Геніальні діти». Хто допоміг сину нардепа Пашинського отримати нову посаду?